everyone. The case building time is up. Are all debaters here? Team Jakarta, are you complete?
Yes.
Team Banten, are you complete?
Banten is complete.
All right. To the edge core. Time is yours.
All right, hello. Okay, so welcome to the final round of National Schools Debating Championship 2010. I'd like to congratulate both sides for making it this far. You've been performing very well, extremely well. But before we proceed any further, we'd like to start by introducing our esteemed panel of judges. First, we have Axel Octarino Chandra from Universitas Katolik Parahyangan, Jawa Barat, with some prestige of being the EFL runner-up, top 5 EFL best speakers in UADC 2019, the AdCore of IFED, Machung English Week 2019, PEDC 2018, UGM ACDC 2018, and the top 10 adjudicators of NUDC 2020 and PDC 2017. Next, we have Bobby Ongkojoyo from Universitas Surabaya, Jawa Timur, with certain prestige, that is champion and best speaker of AEO 2019, grand finalist and 8th best speaker of GeoFed 2019, and part of the adjudication core of ALSA OB 2020, JDF Open 2020, UGM ACC 2020. Here we have Daud Hernaud Christian from Universitas Surabaya, Jawa Timur, as the champion of AEO 2019, HBP 2018, Bipeds and Pro-Ams 2018, part of the adjudication core of GeoFed 2020, FT 2019, and was invited in Breaking Edge in Asia Online Debate 2020, Asia Pro-Ams 2020, Hong Kong Debate Summer 2020, and Malaysia Youth Open 2020. Next, we have Dia Anissa Aprila from Universitas Tadulako, Sulawesi Tengah, as the 9th best novice speaker and novice quarterfinalist of NUDC 2019, the Open Grand Finalist of NUDC 2020, and the quarterfinalist of NSDC 2017. Next, we have Feliani from Universitas Tanjung Pura, Kalimantan Barat, with Open Champion NUDC 2020, Novice Best Speaker and quarterfinalist of NUDC 2019, Breaking Judge of Argumentum Asian 2020, Octo Finalist of IFED 2020, Octo Finalist and 12th Best Speaker of NSDC 2017, and part of the adjudication core of Pajajaran Open 2020. Next, we have Fersolia Larhati YS from UGM, champion of ALSA 2020, JOFA 2017, IFED 2018. Was also the EFL Grand Finalist of ABP 2019 and top 10 Best Speaker and Gold Medalist of NUDC 2019. Next, we have Jin Sanjaya A from Universitas Katolik Parahyangan, Jawa Barat, as the champion of PDO 2016, the semi-finalist of NUDC 2016, UADC 2016 EFL, the best speaker and runner-up of GeoFed 2016, and part of the adjudication core of ALSA OE 2017 and GeoFed 2017. Next, we have Maraya Agnes Matakena from Universitas Patimura, Maluku, champion of NUDC Regionals 2018, NUDC Regionals 2019, the novice semi-finalist of NUDC 2019, and the breaking judge of NUDC 2020.
All right.
Next, we have Muhammad Firyansyah Hualena from Universitas Hasanuddin, Sulawesi Selatan. He was an EFL Grand Finalist and EFL 10th Best Speaker of Asian BP 2019, Adjudication Corps of IVE 2020, and a Grand Final Judge of JOVE 2019, IVE 2020, and NUDC 2020. Next is Muhammad Rizky Akbar Lubis from Universitas Gadjah Mada and Yogyakarta. He was the EFL champion of Asian BP 2020 and Australs 2020. He was the best speaker of NUDC 2020, and he is the open champion of IVED 2019 and IVED 2020. Next, we have Muhammad Zufar Farhan Zuhdi from Universitas Gadjah Mada and also from the Yogyakarta. He is a champion of IVED 2019, IVED 2020, also 2020, ABP 2020 in EFL, Australs 2020 in EFL, Hong Kong Online Pro Am 2020, English Grade 2019, UGM ACDC 2019, USU Open 2018, and NSDC 2017. He was also the best speaker of Hasanuddin BP 2020, KDME 2019, Hong Kong Online Pro Am 2020, AOE 2020, and he was also the runner-up of AOE 2020 and NUDC 2020. Next, we have Ms. Rizky Akita from Universitas Diponegoro, Jawa Tengah. She was an invited and voting judge of NUDC 2013, NUDC 2014, and NUDC 2020. She was the champion and top 10 best speaker of JOVE 2012. She was the runner-up of JDF Open 2014, and she was also part of the adjudication corps for IVE 2014, JOVE 2014, and ALSA OE 2012. Next, we have Mr. Shagung Gunawan Mai from Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta. He was an ESL quarterfinalist of WDC 2019. He is a champion of IVE 2019 and also 2017. He was part of the adjudication corps of NUDC 2019 as well as JOVED 2019. Next, the fabulous Upi Abdurrahman from Institute Teknologi Bandung, Jawa Barat. Upi is a top 10 judge and Open Grand Finals judge of Monash Australs 2020, top 9 and Open Grand Finals judge of UADC 2015, and 4 times breaking judge in the Asian British Parliamentary Debating Championship, and was the Open Grand Finals chair in 2019. And to cap off our amazing 15-person panel, chairing this round is our very own Jane Refefalin from Institut Teknologi Bandung, Jawa Barat. She was the champion of ALSA-OE 2013 and IVE 2015. She was the best speaker of ALSA-OE 2013 and ATMA Open 2018. She was an adjudication corps of NSDC 2018, NSDC 2020, NUDC 2015, NUDC 2019, ATMA Open 2019, IVE 2016, ALSA-OE 2015, and JOVE 2014, and she was also a contingent from DKI for WDC 2013 in Berlin. All right, handing it over to our chair to moderate our debate.
Right. Okay, everyone, welcome to the grand finals of NSDC 2020. Big clap, big clap. In this grand finals, we will have Banten acting as proposition and DKI Jakarta acting as opposition. Under the motion, this House believes that developing countries should allow third parties to bid for the right to govern parts of their territory. Before we start, several housekeeping notes. To remember that POIs are offered after the first and before the 7th minute. Make sure that all speakers have their timers on so that you know when to offer POIs. If in the middle of the speech a connection drop, make sure that speakers pay attention to the chat because our tech team will help you guide through it. Make sure that your camera are on at all times. Make sure that you check your audio and present your POI preference before you start. I think that's also. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome to the center of the screen the first proposition speaker to start the debate. Here.
Am I audible? Okay. For POI, just unmute yourself and interrupt my speech. Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, we think that for the longest amount of time, developing countries have been like underdeveloped, right? Obviously, but one of the reasons as to why this is happening is because most of the time they have a lot of land, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to develop all of the land, right? This looks like Indonesia, for example, where we have like an abundance of land and natural resource, but exactly because it spans and because it's so big, it means that it's going to be very hard for the government to literally focus on like every single one of them, right? That's why under side proposition, we will want to let third parties, like for example, private companies or like entrepreneur to actually govern these areas that actually are in need of development, right? So what will the world look like under our side of the house? Firstly, the government will obviously decide which type of land it is that they are going to bid. Most probably, we are going to choose underdeveloped lands that are empty, right? But obviously have like some type of like potential, for example. But realize how the government will most probably be very strategic, right? That is to say that obviously, if it has like a lot of gold mine in there, we're not going to just simply give them towards these other parties, right? Secondly, we're also going to make sure that the people who are going to be able to bid in these areas are legitimate company, right? It means that we are going to do background checks. It means that we are going to make application that makes it very clear what is it the company is going to do with this land, and we are going to make a contract. This will look like, for example, the company have to tell you whether they are going to build like factories or housings or any of those things. Thirdly, we think that if the company is going to do harm, like for example, if it's going to be toxic to the environment near the other areas, we are going to go. No, thank you. To forfeit their right to actually govern, right? So what is it that we mean though by governing these areas, right? It means that these people are capable of making their own rules within the area. It means that there's going to be no restriction to develop the area as far as it doesn't disrupt like other parts of the country. Even if it is going to do that, we're obviously going to take our hands in there, right? Lastly, like taxation, for example, is also going to happen, even though it's not going to be like as much, right? So with that being said, I have 2 points of argument in this debate. Firstly, regarding why our side of the house can actually develop the area so much better. But secondly, regarding the whole principle and why then it's justifiable for the government to bid these lands, right? So let's move on to the first argument as to why on our side of the house we are capable of developing the area better. First reason, because realize how a lot of the time developing country does not necessarily have enough specialization to develop these areas, right? Realize how a lot of the times developing countries also have other problems, right? Problems like political instability, problems like not equal healthcare, problems like inaccessible education. We think that these are exactly the kind of problem that are being faced by developing countries. Exactly because of that, we don't think that it's possible for a country like Indonesia, for example, to literally give the same development towards every area, right? And we can see this happening in the current status quo. We think that exactly because of that, there's so many untapped potentials, right? And there's also a lot of areas that are ended up not being used, even though there are like potential in these types of areas. We think that exactly because of that, it's only going to create a very low development rate, right? Comparatively, we think that on our side of the house, when we are going to give these areas towards the third parties, it's going to have a much better development. Why is that so? Firstly, because they have to focus on less things, right? When they are going to do this, it means that they don't necessarily have to focus to all of the politics that are happening within the country itself. They don't necessarily have to focus into how then the people will react, etc., right? But secondly, we also think that they have better resources at doing this, right? Realize how when we are going to give them one territory, it means that there's going to be less area that they are going to cover, right? It means that they're capable of focusing on this one area. We think that exactly because of that, it's going to create so much a much better development, right? But what are exactly the development that we're talking about here? We're talking about things like employment, right? Realize how these third parties are most likely capable of creating factories, right? And we think that they can, for example, employ so much more people. Realize how this can make the area look better, for example, so that maybe there's going to be so much more tourism. Realize how this can actually create a much better image for our country at the end. But secondly, as to why under our side of the house we can create a better development, because realize how when we are doing this, we are going to receive a large amount of money, right? When we are going to sell this land, it means that there's going to be a large flow of money coming towards the government. We think that this is good exactly because these money can be used to actually like do infrastructure development on other parts of the area. Realize how right now money from like taxation, for example, are simply not enough, right? Realize how in order for you to be able to fund projects like MRT, for example, you need a lot of money, and we think that this kind of money is exactly something that's going to be beneficial under our side of the house, exactly because we can use it for so many other things in order for us to be more developed, right? But thirdly, realize how on our side of the house we can also get more global recognition, right? When there is going to be so much more areas that are going to be developed, obviously Indonesia is going to countries like Indonesia, for example, is going to be seen as a country that's so much better, exactly because there's so much more development, right? But why then is this important? Because realize that in the current status quo, the rate of globalization is literally so fast, right? Realize how things like globalization literally only benefit countries that are very big, right? Realize how developing countries are most of the time bullied. I think that exactly because of that, there's an urgency for us to be much more to develop our country at a much faster rate. We think that when we let third party do this, it's going to be so much better. Before I move on to my second argument, yes.
If your concern is lack of governance, then why don't you just reform the election system and the political system instead of change the entire system?
We don't think that changing the political system will take a short amount of time, right? Realize how this is exactly the kind of problem that's happening in the developing country right now. We think that we need a much faster solution. We think that our side of the house can solve this even faster. So let's move on to the second argument, why it's principally justifiable for us to do that. Firstly, because we think that the government have the interest to improve equality throughout the country, right? Realize how right now, exactly because government is the only one who's capable of developing a lot of these areas, they're most probably going to prioritize areas like Jakarta, areas like Banten, where they are capable of getting a lot of votes, right? We think that exactly because of that, a lot of areas like Papua, for example, will have a limited amount of funding, right? We think that exactly because of that, inequality is going to be exacerbated in the current status quo. Comparatively, under our side of the house, when we are capable of making more development in like underdeveloped areas through these third parties, it's going to be so much better for inequality, because these third parties are not bound into voting basis, right? Because these third parties are not bound to the political situation that's happening in that current country to begin with. I think that it's going to be so much better, exactly because it's going to create much more equality within the country in and of itself, and we think that this is within the interest of these developing nations. But secondly, why then it's okay for us to sacrifice these lands, right? Because realize how these lands are literally like untapped potentials, right? Realize how these lands have literally never been used by the government or have been poorly developed by the government. We think that exactly because of that, we can create a much better development that is so urgent in the current status quo. We're so proud to propose.
Right, thank you for first proposition speaker. Continue. I would like now to welcome the first opposition speaker. Take the center screen, state your POI preference, count it down so we can begin.
Hello, am I audible? Am I audible? Okay, sorry. You want to POI, you can just unmute. Okay. I'm going to timer. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. What government failed to notice is that selling or making sure that someone has the right to govern over your certain country means you sell your sovereignty. Selling your sovereignty means you betray your people's trust. Moreover, you actually allow more disenfranchisement to happen. We don't want for that to happen. Government needs to defend why it is something that's extremely justified to sell your sovereignty for pragmatic benefits as a nation, allowing extra exploitative laws to come and penetrate. And moreover, they have to explain to us why is this proposal the most exclusive method of trying to gain investments in the first place. Our stance on this debate is firstly, we want to have full power as a nation to govern and set what we think is best for our nation. Government is the body that knows what is best and what things that is best to actually happen in certain places. That's why it is important to have self-governance over its own territory in the first place. Secondly, that exactly under the context of developing countries in which people are underprivileged and impoverished, it's easy to manipulate and control these people. Under our side, government has the moral obligation as a benevolent to protect the people from these kinds of disenfranchisement. We don't want to endorse exploitation to happen in the first place. Lastly, we say that investments can still happen under our side, but the ways that we're going to achieve are things that are better, such as projects, deals, like for example, deals between UN, IMF, and all those things. We still can have pragmatic benefits under our said house. Before I move on to my case, few points of rebuttals towards their said house. Firstly, they tell you that this kind of land that is going to be sold to the people and investors are land that's unoccupied, unused, and all those things. They're not going to be so disproportional. If there's too much gold and all those things, they're not going to sell the area. Ladies and gentlemen, then why would investors and why would certain countries want to buy these areas in the first place? If they cannot see any benefits in this unoccupied land, for example, then they wouldn't want to utilize it in the first place. Secondly, they talk to you that, oh, if there are harsh actions, if there are laws that are too much, we're going to commit supervision and we're going to create restriction. Firstly, what you have to understand, the moment when government actually supervises too much, what's going to happen is that companies and these investors, for example, feel that you actually undercut their benefit when you create laws that are too restrictive. No one would want to listen. No one would want to buy in the end of the day. Secondly, developing country supervision process in the status quo is very unreliable. For example, in Indonesia, with AMDAL and all the laws that we currently have. We still see the Lumpur Lapindo tragedy. We still see massive precedented deforestation in Kalimantan. This proves to you, even if you enact this policy, supervision will still be uncontrollable as these third parties who have bigger power can actually lobby the government and all those things. So that's why we say that their arguments should fall. Moving on to my first case on why it's extremely unjustified. What we have to understand firstly is that people voted for the government because of two things. Firstly, because the people vote for policies that would make them prosper. Secondly, they want protection as a citizen. That's why they give mandate to the government. In a democratic system, you endorse certain candidates, for example, because you understand they're able to protect me at the best. You want best protection for yourself. Of course, you don't want to be disenfranchised as a nation. So there's this huge obligation as a government to fulfill its people's rights. Because when you actually vote, means that you consent to any, for example, law, because you understand that person is able to represent me and protect me at its best. That's why for law and legislation as a parallel example, you still have to vote for DPR in Indonesia. So what does this mean when we actually allow this land to be sold and you actually like trade for this right to govern? First, we forget the huge burden that these people actually put into the government. That's to say that might as well, we don't need to do an election if government sells this land for pragmatic benefits. Second, we violate people's consent. Even if like under government, there's still like social contact, like government like creates laws that people have to abide to. This is like forcing all those things. At least this is a mandate that people put. Thirdly, the kind of territory that's going to be exploited are areas that actually have, are actually like, for example, potential to people, especially underprivileged communities. For example, sawah and or like land of people. When you take this land because government see that this is like unoccupied, this is like actually take away the right of living of these people, the right, because like, for example, they have to be a petani because they cannot actually like live in cities, etc. But lastly, it's also cultural lands and all these areas. It's harmful when the government actually allows exploitation to happen in these places. Under opposition, even if in the worst case scenario, law is not supportive towards you, for example, there's omnibus law, for example, under our side, government can still revise. There's still process that we can take, such as the judicial trial that we can take under Mahkamah Konstitusi. So we've proven to you that under their side, protection is never going to happen, because now these kind of people have the right to governance. When it's like governed, these kinds of people can change their agenda. Why? Firstly, because they are economic capitalists. They're willing to, the fact that they're willing to invest is because they're very rich and all those things. They're willing to exploit, understanding the context that this is developing nations with underprivileged communities. It's going to be easier to manipulate. Secondly, even if government has supervision methods, they would not hear if it is unprofitable or if it is something that's actually very, very bad in the status quo. So what's going to happen when these people actually change the laws and change the things that actually govern that area? What's going to happen is that there's instability, right? People are confused and people don't know why is this happening. What happens? There's backlash. And what happens when backlash happens? Firstly, there's going to be an authoritarian regime, and there's going to be like so many outrage, for example, such as, for example, like the 1998 outrage. There's going to be so much violence. Secondly, if there's violence, that means that there's instability. Our country is perceived as bad in the international community. There would be any investments. People are scared, and because this country, for example, is prone to conflict, so on and so forth. Moving on to my second case, where you actually get benefits under our side of the house. I'm going to ultimately prove why we actually get so much economic benefits under our side. Firstly, we say in status quo, investors are willing to actually invest without having to bid these rights to govern, such as Freeport coming to Indonesia. Multinational corporations such as Nike, Adidas actually wants to adhere to labor standards of our nation, even if they're exploitative at the worst case. Then, because government still has the power to control the regulation, we can set regulations that's run, and they're the sovereign actor in this debate. Secondly, the moment when there's distrust that I've proven to you, there's backlash, and when there's instability, when under our side of the house, people actually feel protected, represented, there's no backlash, you create stability. Stability would actually invite these investors to come to get economical benefits under our side of the house. But lastly, in the global communities acts, the moment you protect your people and sovereignty, the precedence is that you're protective towards your people. International communities such as the United And secondly, we get so much benefits under our side of the house. And for all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Right. I would like to thank the leader of opposition. Let us continue. I would like to now welcome the second speaker of proposition to the center screen. State your POI preference, count it down, and we can start.
Am I audible?
Try again.
Am I audible?
Try again.
The audio is laggy.
Hello? Should I turn off my camera?
I think that would be better, yeah. Try turning off your camera. Okay, try again.
Hello?
Yeah, this is better. Okay.
Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Wait.
Let me set my Okay, let me set my timer first. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I think side opposition have to clarify that not all developing countries have that kind of capabilities to do so. Developing countries are the one that need the urgency to have the fastest money as possible. That is to say, in our side, we are the one who can have like the best amount of time to recover our nation as fast as possible. This is something that won't exist in their side of the house. 3 things that I like to discuss in this debate. First class, on which side is more aligned to the interests of developing countries and the government itself. Second class, on which party better develop the areas. And thirdly, I will add an extension on how our side create better funding to developing countries. Now let's move on to my first class on why our side is more aligned to the interests of developing countries and the government itself. So basically, all their arguments are being based that you won't give any kind of sovereignty, that you will take away their sovereignty, that the people are in that countries are not consented in the first place. Panels, firstly, realize that all of my previous speaker told you that this land that will be sold are abandoned land that are underdeveloped, but that don't have any people in that land itself. But realize that even if so, we don't think that it's best for you to just like glorify the idea of sovereignty when you don't have the capability to do so. Because mostly happen in developing countries, they don't have that much money and specialties as a government. You can't have better sovereignty if you can't even have the capability to do so. When your land are literally dying because you don't have like the amount of money to make it sustain for the better. But even if there will be people that starting to go into that, the businessman make cities or sectors, for example. That means the one who live in that land are people already consented to live there. The one who have the interest on how they government this land. We think that these people are the one who have like the freedom of choice whether they want to live in this land or not. But fourthly, even if this person are like the one who already live in these countries and like suddenly the businessman come in, it's also okay, right? Because realize that they always have to a choice whether they want to continue live in that country, in that land or not. But also, even if they always, but realize that in our side, we will pay these people to move to other place, right? So we won't like concretely just being abandoned people. This is not on how like people, this is not on how like the businessman actually work. Realize that in status quo, when government want to make a building, for example, if they want to ship other people, they actually pay these people to move to someone else. But even if they are trying to ship, but also, secondly, about the responsibility of the government. Even if like for example, they are trying to shift their responsibilities, that's still okay because that means you have the people that more incentivized to develop your land for the better. Realize that both sides, government being irresponsible, still exists. But in our side, at least now, rather than the government totally abandon this land, you shift their responsibility to the people who's more worth to change that land for the better. Secondly, realize that the government focus on metropolitan cities. This is something that they don't really notice, right? Because realize that, for example, like Papua and Jakarta, they have like very different amount of like development. We think that the interest of the government itself, they always have like the interest to equal their citizens' need, to equal their life for the better. But this is something that won't achieve in their side of the house. But now let's move on to my second class on which party better develop the areas. But before I move on to my second class, yes.
I don't quite understand what the development will look like. Do these companies are they going to make factories or what?
Panels, realize that my previous speaker have told you, yes, this investor can do like any kind of other thing. For example, maybe they can have like farm, for example, or any kind of other thing. But even if I already told you, if they want to make housing, the people that would be in that housing are the people who's already consented to that government itself. But now let's move on to my second class on which parties better develop the areas. Now, basically, they say that it's exploitation to the companies, exploitation to the companies. Panels realize that we already make a clear requirement on how we can beat that, on how we can beat this line, right? So it won't be like any kind of people that don't have like the credibility to do so. The one who would be in that list that have that can bid is the one that can have like a better control of that land. But secondly, even if this requirements are still big in the first place, realize that reputation still exists. Realize that business or nation itself have the reputation to continuously have like better reputation to that. To their nation. That is to say, if people know there are being exploitation to some land, there will be like any kind of like other media that massively set them that they are being disruptive for the first place. We think that this kind of reputation is enough to deter them to do any kind of destruction towards this land. Now let's move on to my extension on how our side create better funding to developing countries. We have to acknowledge that as developing countries, you don't have that much money to govern your city to the fullest extent. What we need is funding as fast as possible to fix the underdeveloped part of that religions. So two things I'm going to bring this in this extension. Firstly, on the recovery, on how we can recover fastly. We think that the urgency right now is to gain more money as fast as possible because realize that the more you left out that land with no money, it will be more severe in time to time. It's like developing countries like Indonesia, for example, that often have earthquake. The more you neglect that land, the cost you get will be more severe. That's why we want to bid, because it's not like have to create businesses and connect yourself to investor that takes so much time and specialty to begin with. Meanwhile, bid, yes, there'll be a requirement for you to control that land, but realize that people always have the interest to invest in developing countries. But realize it will create like better order of the government. If we take it too long, people will actually backlash towards the government. They can't take they cannot take care of their land that they actually govern. So the only alternative that the government can give is recovering their land as possible by giving it to someone that have the better capability to the first place. That is why we create an alternative to make their land recover as fast as possible and lending it to someone who's have like, the capability of making it better. But on the second part, on how our site will still connect to investor better, realize that in the long term, we always have connect to the investor better, but their side can't connect because the investor oftentimes have two key aspects of reasoning. A is because there will be less people that will invest on companies when there's no developed companies on that land itself, or like there's no shop, there's no like concrete life that you could actually invest in that land. But B, because government don't have that much connection, rather than we give them to the private businessmen or other nations, so we can have like better relationship within that countries or investor. Because realize government don't have enough capability on making strategy to invest. They don't have that much connection rather than the private businessman or other nation. This will be resolved in two key aspects. A, if you bid it to the businessman, they'll be far more better because they are the one who have like continuously do business and many special aspects that they do know on what best for that country. But B, even if it's a nation, that means you can have better relationship with that country. Most of the country that will pay bid is that the developed countries, right? That have the capacities to bid this land. I think as developing countries, it's a huge advantage for you to have better connection with developing countries, better trade and funding, cause some of their land exists. So they always have because they always have like this land exists in developing countries, they always have the interest to continuously fund because they want to maintain their land as best as possible. They always have the continuous reason to fund their land. So what did I push in this way? A is on why our side is more aligned to the interest of the developing countries, and secondly, with why our parties better develop the areas and why we solve the economic and urgency problem on the status quo. So proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for second speaker proposition. I would now like to call upon the second speaker from opposition team. Whenever you are ready, count it down, state your POI preference, and then we can start.
Check. Am I audible? Okay. My preferred POI is through mic. I'm going to get to you. Give me a second. Okay. Is it still laggy if I turn on the video?
Try speaking.
Test. Am I laggy?
Yes, the audio became laggy, so I think it's better if you just turn it on.
Yeah. Okay. Wait. I'm gonna set my timer. Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. With a weak mechanism under government team, this policy cannot run. It will only exploit natural resources even more, increasing disparity of region development. We think all of their benefits fall with their own inconsistent characterization of each company, of investors on how developing countries. In our side of the house, we focus on one thing, the cultural and like indigenous people, but we also focus on investors and economic. We focus on policy that matters. We don't think that it's just about economy in itself. If we can prove to you that developing countries can run in itself with the alternative that exists, that's to say investments and so on and so forth, and B, we're going to maintain sovereignty and we're able to, it's justified to maintain sovereignty, we win this debate. I'm going to address 3 points in this debate. Firstly, it is okay to trade off economic benefits, a trade off sovereignty for economic benefits. Point 2, on how development of regions work. Point 3, on my extension, how this policy will sacrifice the most important actor in this debate. First point, regarding trade-off and sovereignty, right? We told you from Jeremiah, that sovereignty is important because people choose you from voting an election, for example, in DPR or parliamentary voting, for example, when you vote for DPR, that's to say you vote for people who makes rules in the DPR, right? That's to say, when you let this bidding happen, that means that you are allowing companies to violate all of the votings that you did parliamentary, because in the end of the day, the people who govern you is not the DPR people, but the companies and the third entities and other nations even who are going to govern you. But moreover, on their best case, right, it's not true that it's okay to trade off like our entire sovereignty to other third parties like countries, right? Right? Why? Because opposition team never explain any precedents coming from side proposition from developing countries sacrificing sovereignty for economic benefits, right? Moreover, it's never okay to sacrifice workers and indigenous rights for economical benefits when you give your entirety of governance to other countries and nations that might violate your rights. But moreover, on bidding, the higher the bidder, that means the richest entity to bid the highest to certain countries. That's to say, these are countries like China and the US who are extremely exploitative to countries like, it's proven on Freeport before Jokowi's term where Freeport was on like 70% and then now it's 50% when Indonesia gained sovereignty over it, right? It's going to be really harmful when we are under-regulating these companies and countries like US and China to dominate places like that is strategic like Papua, for example, or like Java. Other than that, private companies are, for example, like infrastructure companies from China who will dominate places like Japanese, for example. That means that they're going to dominate Jakarta and Bandung and Jakarta, and they will ignore people who actually need like cultural benefits or other benefits and like champion these kinds of infrastructure benefits. But moreover, this means that people will not trust you as the government, knowing that you give your trust upon other countries to govern their other countries. Why, right? Because the obligation, the expectation that the people have when they vote for you is that you're going to govern them, not other countries or other companies, right? That's to say you remove any trust of the people or the regions that's given by the like companies and third parties. Why is that so important, right? Because if you want to be re-elected, you have to get the trust of the people. When you are able to do that by giving your because you're unreliable and you give other like governance to other countries, it's seen that you are untrustable because you're giving it to other exploitative countries and places like China, for example. So in the end of the day, it's never worth it to trade off sovereignty. The second of all, like development of regions. Let's engage with their base case scenario, how they're going to create better development. But we question what is the agenda of the third party. They never tell you what is the interest of companies and like third parties that are going to dominate. I'm going to elaborate this even more. On private companies, they have an inherent capitalistic nature, that's to say gain profit. But why is it so harmful? They will scrap rules that don't benefit them, like labor rules, anti-monopoly law, antitrust law will be scrapped by these companies. Moreover, they're going to remove every worker's right to apply for for dismissal and whatnot. They will try to implement contracts that's dangerous, for example. But moreover, if one company like infrastructure projects like Sinarmas dominate one region or more, they will do anything in their power to destroy any kinds of competitions or infrastructure project. This is monopoly and it's dangerous. But why is it so dangerous, right? 3 layers of reasons why. Firstly, government cannot protect laborers when they know that these companies can like violate any kinds of laborers, workers that's working under Sinarmas. But secondly, government cannot control the quality of the infrastructure projects, right? Because they can just dominate any kinds of quality and make it and cut corners, for example, to make the quality cheaper so that they have more profit. But thirdly, government cannot protect consumer because these people cannot choose the kinds of products that they can use. If the product is bad, they cannot opt into other products because the company is dominating the region. If service is bad, you can choose other options because you cannot choose to maintain for example, you can choose to maintain agriculture in Japanese and in Jogja, but these companies endorse industrialization in Jogja, for example. This is going to be really dangerous when companies dominate, especially there's no like policies, right? But these policies have been really and so on and so forth. The best case, if regulation is good and bad, will be really, really bad for these people and the improvement of this developing country. Moreover, third parties don't have obligation to dominate all regions and to fix all regions in Indonesia, for example, right? That's to say, lands that will bid it are the most strategic lands. The not important land will be sacrificed because no third party wants to govern them. That means that the problem of untouched and underdeveloped lands will be underdeveloped. It's never a strategy developed, and strategic locations will still exist inside opposition if they will rely to third party to bid, which will be rare or never in the unstrategic locations. In our side, government have obligation to develop all kinds of lands regardless of the utility because we have the biggest obligation to the people that vote for us. For moreover, than to say that the development of regions will be much better in our side of the house when the government have the biggest obligation, expectation to do so. Moreover, the government have all the ability to do so, right? But my third explanation, how this policy will sacrifice the most important actor in this debate. Citizens vote certain leaders that cater to their needs. But why is it important? Because different regions have different needs of cultures and ethnicity, or even like products, and it feels like there's countries who are more metropolitan, there are more agricultural countries, or there are more mining countries like Papua, for example, right? On side proposition, cultural and indigenous communities are looked upon by third parties because their interest there is for economic incentive and not cultural incentive. But why culture and indigenous people is so important in these countries, right? Because some of them don't want economic developments or infrastructure projects at all. Their needs is only for government to help them preserve their culture, like Bali, Toraja, and Papua. That's why Balinese protested for the amounts of tourists that destroyed Bali's environment and stained their culture like white people, right? On side opposition, citizens vote for politicians who can champion indigenous rights, culture, and religious believers for the citizens. They capitalize culture to a certain extent, as long as it doesn't violate their native and cultural threshold. There were still check and balance in Bali when they got really mad, right? Moreover, the role of agenda of developing countries is from investment, right? Why? Because we can be stable and accountable when we have like a long-term policy, for example, who don't change occasionally. Why? Because inside opposition, the policy in a certain region will be changing as the bid changes, right? For example, that's to say, investors don't want to bid in a country with changing policies, right? Because it will be confusing for the investors, as the rules will be complicated and the restriction will be really weird because every regions have different kinds of rules. For example, this will be really bad because in our side of the house, the rules will be like generalized and policy blanket. For example, like omnibus law applies to the entire Indonesia, not just Jakarta, right? That's to say, like investors going to only look for one law, for example, or one article in order to invest in Indonesia. Inside opposition, you will have to like inside government, you're going to have to look upon like different kinds of rules in every region. It's going to be really confusing for investors. They will not be attracted at all. In the end of the day, investment in their side of the house will be worse, even though they are governed by countries that is really rich or companies that are really rich. We're so proud to.
Okay, thank you for second speaker, opposition. I would now like to welcome the third proposition speaker to the center screen. Whenever you are ready, state your POI preference, count it down, and we can start.
Hi Kak, are we lagi? Is it lagi?
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. I prefer POIs where done just through your voice. Just unmute your mic and say POI. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, both sides of this debate want to reach the same end goal. That is actually being able to develop your country, right? To actually bring growth, to bring success. But what side opposition has failed to do is show how in this urgent state of development, why investors will actually meet this urgent demand and rapid development, and why they're actually going to be better than these companies or beneficial at all for that matter. Before I move on to my two clashes, which is firstly, which side of the house brings development, and secondly, which side of the house actually brings more equality, I'm going to point out 3 strategic flaws from side opposition's case. First of all, when they question why these people will be incentivized at all. Panel, realize that we already told you from the very first that full autonomy is really incentivizing and interesting for these companies, right? It doesn't matter if it's uninhabited or not, because of things like land scarcity and the fact that you're able to get full autonomy over this land. This is something that they can get, they can't get anywhere else. Side opposition has not been engaging on this premise at all. Their scope of this debate is really small. But also, unlike how supervision will not exist, obviously the harms of this territory is harming our country also, and it exceeds this territory, things like pollution, things like harming citizens. Obviously, governments do have the obligation to protect citizens as well. But on their point on investors and how investors won't be actually interested when they see this panel, I think there needs to be a delineation of whether or not these territories will also be considered in the economic profile, right? Realize that the laws that these companies make wouldn't be considered as the laws that these countries make as well. There needs to be a difference that side opposition actually concedes to. But thirdly, I don't think we're selling all of our territories, right? Beautiful places like Bali, for example, the government, they are gaining so much revenue from that. The governments are strategic, and side opposition has not been able to concede to that, right? In the worst case scenario, however, this capitalizing culture, at least global, this is where sovereignty is actually upheld. But onto my first clash of which side of the house brings more development. Under this, we already talked about 2 things, which is firstly, developing countries don't have enough specialization and capital to actually bring development at a rapid state. And we said that this is so urgent because in order to actually keep up with the worsening state of income inequality from globalization, for example, is actually urgent. But secondly, on the importance of short-term liquidity for government, right? And how developing countries really needed this, especially in times where crisis or where they're prone to crisis, things like natural disasters, things like pandemics, and etc. What do we get in response? 2 responses. Firstly, on their claim on how we have investors and that is enough. Panel, in order for side opposition to win this debate, it wasn't enough to literally just name the harms of our proposal. They have to prove why these other alternatives are feasible and genuinely beneficial in comparison to our proposal, right? Because the only alternative that we get from side opposition is that we have investors already. Panel, developing countries are lacking in investors for the exact reason that they are really corrupt, for the exact reason that the labor standards are too high, and for example, the number of holidays we have in Indonesia that doesn't attract MNCs and investors and etc. Right? The reason why being able to bid for a territory actually solves this problem is exactly because these nations and individuals and entrepreneurs don't need to care about how horrible the government is in the country. They can make their own rules. This means that our case is more feasible and is more likely in attracting people to actually come, right? But realize that even if not, these investors actually do more harm than good in our country. For example, alternative that they have is actually harmful to the people in the country, where these investments, for example, give a false sense of security exactly because foreign investments tend to be very short-term and extra sensitive to crisis or pandemic, right? It's really easy to pull out your investments because they're unstable. We already showed you why. However, selling off and bidding off territory won't be like this because you literally buy this land. Exactly because the demand of this territory also, even in uninhabited areas, getting full autonomy is real. There is sort of a constant incentive even in the midst of crisis, right? But in our worst case scenario, investors only invest in high potential areas. No, thank you. So areas that already are developed are gaining international attention. The fact that you get autonomy is so incentivizing. Any land will do. Let's talk about the interests of private companies. Panel, we
can see that it is money, but that's exactly why it's extremely beneficial, right? Because of this like economic development, okay, first of all, like we have to point out that there also is an incentive to like, not breach labor standards, because dealing with labor unions, for example, are really expensive, but also getting this economic development also contributes to things like employment and etc. But why is this so important? Because their benefit is literally contingent upon investors. Panel, we question what the definition of development is for them, however, because realize that investors are only usually attracted in places that are already like good and etc. because like, there are more options and there isn't this incentive of autonomy. We don't want only development in Jakarta or Banten, for example. We want development in like rural areas like Papua and Riau. But onto my second clash of which side of the house actually brings more equality, right? What do we say under this clash already? We talked about development inequality, how there's limited capital and human capital to do this in the government. We get no response to this. But also, we talked about why it's justified to actually sacrifice land for the greater good of development, for the greater good of economy. What do we get in response? Three responses, sorry. First of all, on exploitation. I'm going to talk about three things here. Panel, firstly, we think that this isn't true. We already told you that obviously there are checks and balances, like the UN, for example, and etc. But in our worst case scenario, however, this isn't exclusive. MNCs also have been notorious for literally taking over with like predatory pricing and like breaking human rights, things like Nike sweatshops, Adidas sweatshops in Indonesia. But in our worst case scenario, under our side of the house, when you are a private entity, for example, a land over a certain territory, you literally have unlimited liability. Your responsibility is complete here, and any problem where any human right breach is your responsibility as a company, as a territory. But if you're merely an investor, literally, you can just do things like hide behind the government. This is what companies like Nike does, right? For example, like hiding behind corrupt governments in order for them to breach labor standards. This won't happen when you literally have full autonomy and therefore full responsibility of these areas. But onto their second claim on how selling land equals selling sovereignty. First of all, panel, we get no process analysis as to what this means at all, right? Like the term sovereignty is very arbitrary. We question what they meant by this point. But second of all, we also genuinely don't understand why this is true, right? We don't understand why developing countries and their inhabitants have such a strong connection to uninhabited lands that they will literally do things like backlash and riots, right? But even if this is true, realize that human beings tend to not be philosophical, but they tend to be utilitarian, meaning that when they do see the new jobs, meaning that when they do see new development, and when they see how uninhabited lands actually became, sites that had employment, they will be more satisfied. But onto their point of voting, panel, literally, you gave these governments the decision, you voted them in order to make these decisions that are in your best interest. So we don't understand why our side of the house is a threat to democracy at all. But also, we already talked about how we won't be forcing these individuals to go into these areas, right? We won't force them to stay in these territories, for example. If that labor standards are that bad, that means there's also other corporations that they can work in. We don't understand why this is such an important point. For those reasons, we are so proud to propose.
Right, thank you, third proposition speaker. To close the substantive debate, I would like to now welcome the third opposition speaker to the center screen. Whenever you are ready, state your POI preference, count it down, and we can start.
Okay, so hi, the condition right now is not friendly with the weather, so we're going to switch places for a while. Is that fine?
Switch places as in?
Move to another room.
Okay.
So you can hear us better.
Okay.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, I hope this works out. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition cannot throw around the word development 30 times in between the last 3 speakers of their team and expect to win. This debate was never about letting third parties simply invest or making business and making employment, but rather it was about letting them governing your territory, letting them creating the rules and letting them set labor standards, for example. This is the nuance that we never get to hear from their team, from their third speaker. It's too late for them to do it in their reply. I'm going to do 2 things in my speech. First, I'm going to deal on a principle basis. Is it justified to do so? And secondly, I'm going to think about the pragmatic harms, everything I want to talk about development, which is just uncertain actually. But before that, several pieces of clarification. The first of which is that they took a bizarre half stance that I really want to emphasize, because this was about a right for these third parties to govern. Any benefits of having companies make a factory by moving their operations here, for example, was symmetric for our side of the house. But on their side, these third parties are the ones who dictate how much minimum wage these workers actually have, how much labor standards these people will get on your side of the house. We never actually see a mechanization of how development will actually occur. And that was the big reason that they already lost this debate. But second, it was ludicrous of them to say that there's going to be a delineation of policy of the government and policy of these third party. This means that any benefit on their side of the house was going to be symmetrical to whatever happens on our side. At best, at worst, this is just them backing out of the debate by wanting to haul up all our benefits the moment they realize they cannot win. So 2 clashes in my speech. First, on the justification, right? The biggest premise coming from them was that, oh, this land is untapped potential. The government can do anything with it. And that is fine. 2 responses to this. First, giving up your land sovereignty is not always justified. Presumably, you have gotten this land after arising from colonialism, for example, and you care about this a whole lot. This is where the mismatch happens, because they never actually tell you how this development will go back and help the people and help the nation itself. Ultimately, if you at least want to sell a bit of your land to a highest bidder, at least you need to get some form of economic benefit to you. But the money that you get from this bidding is not going to be significant. I'm going to prove that later on. But secondly, the only thing we get from them was that, we need to make places equal. We need funding for Papua, for example. This is not sufficient, because if they care about equality so much, proposition makes it worse. Because on their side, it looks like recruiting certain laborers, but giving them very low wages, for example, and giving them horrible living standards and horrible environmental damage on your side of the house, the moment these countries can simply bypass their umbrella, no thank you, and bypass all the policies that the government already placed. The second thing they say here, when they realized they could not win, was that there's no people in these areas anyway. First, this is wildly dismissive to our team's characterization. Land that exists somewhere is presumably still being governed by some form of regional government. That means you still own that land, regardless of whether or not there was people. There are still presumably people staying in Papua. Everything about my second speaker's attention about indigenous people. Some of them don't want economic development. And it was weird of team proposition to simply generalize that this is the one thing that everyone wants in these areas. We heard no response coming from third speaker. These were the vulnerable actors that they never engaged with. The second thing they said here was that, these people already consent to governments in the area. Precisely, they consented to the governments, not towards these investors. In our side, you get to vote for which type of governments and which type of similar policies they will place, but the investors, these people don't actually have a say. This reveals an important tension in their case, why they cannot win this principal clash. But thirdly, they say, they can always choose to leave, and we will subsidize them if they want to leave. Then this undercuts any of their benefits panel, because if you get some money from the bidding, you're still using that money to reallocate people. You're still using that money to move people away. So given that there's a huge economic trade-off, then precisely this is a zero-sum game, except now part of your land is owned by China. Your citizens don't benefit at all. Our main argument here in this clash was that it was a principal assault on the democratic right of these citizens. Because citizens consented to the government by voting, it is unclear to me how individuals on the ground actually will have a say in what these companies do. But ultimately, simply because there was never engagement, I think this clash actually should be weighed more for 3 reasons. First, that the people on the ground are the most vulnerable actor for 2 reasons. first, that these are developing countries with certain interests with mind. We say that they want a certain democracy, that particularly the people in these areas cannot be generalized to only wanting certain economic development. But secondly, you are giving these people in the mercy of these third parties. They are the ones who are facing the impacts to the rules that these third parties makes. They're the ones who get lower minimum wage, who get lower labor rights, for example. It is unclear to me how proposition wants to mechanize the protection of these people on the ground. But secondly, they massively undercut the role of the government in this case to protect the people on the ground, to protect their basic voting rights. On our side, governments are the ones who have a balance that even if your government is corrupt, at least there are internal checks and balances with the government as one entity, as opposed to you having some random company in your back door and letting them make the rules on your side. But third, proposition's benefit was uncertain and the likelihood of it happening are not high either. The claim was not only about investment, but rather about the right to govern and control to the power of the people on the ground. So on that principle basis alone, we've already won this debate. It was enough for us to win. But I'm going to be charitable and I'm going to deal with everything on development in my second clash, on the pragmatic harms and benefits that exist on their side. But let's characterize the interests of these third parties, because proposition wants you to believe that these third parties are so benevolent that they only want to come here to develop your land, etc. The motion literally says that you have to defend private companies who are heavily profit-oriented and want to maximize profit by reducing costs of like paying for these laborers or paying for any government taxes, for example, right? But second, other nations can also invest in your land. They might have both economic and also international-based interests. And this is likely if you want to accept the characterization of proposition that it was so urgent to get these money, then that means nations like China, nations like US will see a very big importance in taking this land by being able to dump all their products there and destroy local industry means that you don't get meaningful and organic economic development on their side of the house. What they try to claim here. Developing countries cannot develop the area. That was their first claim. They talk about how there will be corrupt governments. I don't see why these companies will not be as corrupt as these governments, even if there's like a different structure, right? Because we need to analyze the incentives. On our side, governments still have a mandate in a democracy to at least cater to the people at best. On your side, these companies are more prone to horrible incentives in which they only want to maximize profit by bypassing regulations, etc. The second thing we get here was that we don't actually see what type of development you guys are talking about, because they want to say that you are going to make factories, but they're also going to have some sort of tourism. You cannot have both when these factories are going to make the environment so horrible on your side. This is significant tension in their case, because the reason why factories can employ more people, why you can open more land for factories, is because you cut down certain types of trees and you bypass the regulations that happen on our side. Because you lower labor standards, you remove antitrust laws that stop companies from being monopolistic, for example. The harms of this are clear, and this is something that they must concede to. The second type of thing that they said here was that, we need a large flow of money, and this is how we get money for these developing countries. One, this was not exclusive, and there are taxations, there are other investors, but how investors like our country, right? Labor standards can still change on our side, but at least the government is the one within control to see whether or not they want certain types of investors or not. That is a concession that on their side, the people will gain harm by lowering labor standards. Crucially, this means on their side, you are stuck with one source of income. When China takes a piece of land in Sri Lanka, and when they don't see any benefit in that anymore, nobody want to invest in that area, for example, anymore. But thirdly, you create instability on their side because there's large backlash. This is where backlash is important, because in the case of Freeport, that's why you see a lot of people still having public outcry. So everything about backlash and mass scrutiny doesn't actually work as a mechanism, because that's why Nike factories are still being horrible to laborers after. In Bangladesh. What is the conclusion? Proposition has weaved themselves into a trap that the reply speaker cannot escape. The more you regulate and supervise these companies, the more you undercut your benefit. The more you deregulate them and let them do whatever they want, that means you deprioritize the people. And on the ground of a principle and pragmatic level, we oppose.
Right, thank you for third opposition speaker. Closing the case for opposition, I would like to now welcome the opposition reply speaker. Here.
Check, am I audible? All right, give me a second. I'm going to start my speech. In 3, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels notice the big contradiction in their own case inside government. They want development, but they let people in the region to leave. They hate investors, and they will take China exploitative infrastructure projects. So we question the benefit that they're going to get inside, because they just can't get away with bidding will make developing countries rich and ignore every single important actor in this debate. That's to say voters, indigenous communities, agricultural regions, and all kinds of strategic locations that will be untouched upon by these companies. If we can prove to you that A, that team opposition can protect actors, that's really important in this debate. B, and how regional development can happen regardless of this motion, we win this debate. Firstly, on protecting people, we told you that it's not okay to sacrifice people's needs because there's a lot of that at stake, which is to say that's people who are in agricultural locations, for example, people who don't need like economic developments happening in Bali, in Papua, and Toraja, for example. Their only response to this is, oh, it's okay to sacrifice people's needs and wants for economic development without any precedence of Indonesia, for example, sacrificing these kinds of things for economic development, because understand our case still exists. Moreover, we told you that people who vote are the people who want, who demands economic development, who demands certain policies to the government, right? That's to say, if the government gives all the ultimate autonomy, what propositions try to claim, that means that they're giving all the autonomy of the people to the for the companies to do. That's to say that we are not hurt as a people. That's to say that the people will lose trust upon the government. They will not re-elect the government. This was extended in my second speaker speech when I told you that the government's want is to be re-elected, and this will be really bad for the government if the people lose trust upon the government. But moreover, the only response is that, oh, there will be backlash and riots. So we don't understand how backlash and riots will result into change in their side of the house when the companies are extremely exploitative, explained by my first, second, and third speaker, right? Their only case in this case is that there's check and balances because there's the UN. It doesn't translate to good supervision, and there's no explanation how the UN can suddenly make Indonesia and developing countries better because they're just UN. Secondly, they told you human right breach is the third party's culpability. Exactly, this is why it's really extremely exploitative. It's like I've explained in my second speaker speech why it's so exploitative. I'm going to extend more in my second clash. But moreover, on first clash, is to say we win this clash by explaining how we protect people. For example, indigenous communities don't even want economic development, right? But second of all, region development. They told you that they're going to give all autonomy to all third parties. We question how policies like antitrust law, anti-monopoly, or labor law operate in their side of the house. With their logic, and third parties have ultimate autonomy, third parties can just scrap all these policies. Second speaker and third speaker have extended told you why this is really problematic, because monopoly can be dangerous when the government cannot control inequality, cannot protect the peoples, and cannot protect the workers in their soul. But moreover, they told you in third speaker government whip, they told you investors do harm than more good in the country. Then we question, how do you get economic development if their side of the house tell you that the investors do harm than good in the country? Moreover, government told you, oh, we won't give places out like Bali. This is crystallized, and we told you that if you want a good strategic companies, then you'll be taken away places like Bali. So if we question if that third parties won't bid for strategic locations, what kind of regions you're going to give to third parties? It's unclear on-site proposition. Also, third parties won't bid for unstrategic locations in our side of the house. This was never responded. My extension is not even responded. We're so proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for opposition reply speaker. To conclude the government case and the debate as a whole, I would like now to welcome the proposition reply speaker to take the center screen. You're here.
Am I audible?
It's pretty laggy. We really do hope that, yeah, it's better if you just turn off the camera. Yeah, okay.
Okay, yep. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two parameters in which you're supposed to judge this debate, right? Firstly, regarding which side of the house is actually which side of the house's action is much more justifiable, and secondly, which side of the house can actually create better development, right? And which are the actors that can actually bring out the development that we want under both sides of the house. So let's move on to the first thing, right? Regarding justification, right? So our side of the house have already proven to you in this debate how on our side of the house we can actually create equality, right? Exactly because the government runs under this basis that have to that most probably they're going to only focus on regions that have the most vote, like Jakarta, for example, or Banten, is exactly why there is no equality that happens in the current status quo, right? A lot of states like Papua, for example, a lot of states like Kalimantan, for example, does not have as much attention, exactly because the government realized that they're not going to have as much vote from these region, right? We think that exactly because of that, the government is already not equal, right? But that's why we think that on the other side of the house, it's going to be so much more better the moment that we are capable of providing another option for these region in order for them to be able to also enjoy the actual development that happens in other parts of like cities in Indonesia, right? We think that our side of the house is more equal. But secondly, we've also proven to you as to how then on our side of the house, it's okay for us to sacrifice land, because firstly, we are going to most probably be giving out empty lands, right? We're most probably, and like investors would probably still would want to go into these lands exactly because of the amount of power that they are capable of holding the moment that they are going to get these land, right? But slight opposition then come into this debate saying that, oh, we cannot sacrifice our land because there's like a lot of things, like there are like indigenous people in these land, for example, and they don't even want like economic development to begin with, right? Well, firstly, we question then why the government is so much of a we think that firstly, under our side of the house, most probably the government will not want to give out these lands if there is going to be that much backlash, right, ladies and gentlemen? We don't think that the government is that stupid. So we don't think that is a very likely scenario. But even if it is a very likely scenario, realize how a lot of the times government also exploit indigenous land, right? Realize how in Canada, for example, they are like using indigenous land to have like this oil pipeline, right? We don't understand why then government is so benevolent, like what side proposition tries to paint to you in this debate. We think that on our side of the house, we get much more equality, and we think that it's and we think that it's okay for us to sacrifice these lands. But even if these principles does not stand, we think that the most important thing in this debate is the benefit that we are going to be able to achieve under our side of the house. What are the benefits? We've already proven to you as to how on our side of the house we get more development, right? Why is that so? Because most probably these third parties are going to be much more focused on developing these land exactly because it's most probably going to be like a small part of the country, right? Secondly, they also have much more resource. It means that they have more money, for example. They have more people who are expert at doing that. Thirdly, they also does not have to focus on other things like corruption, for example. They don't have to focus on other things like the broken political system that they also have to fix, right? These are exactly the things that make third parties and especially a beneficial actor to give these kinds of development towards the country in and of itself. But then side opposition came into this debate saying that no, government is a better actor because there is more accountability, because like we vote for them and etc. Right? But realize how in the current status quo, when we do let government do the development, realize how there's so little development that actually happens. Right? Realize how there's literally so many states that are being neglected. We don't think that by being accountable, it means that you are going to be a good government, right? Because realize how like Indonesia's government is literally so bad to the point where like even they can pass something like the omnibus law, right? I think that exactly because of that, our benefit still stands true until the end of this debate. We think that you should vote for side proposition.
All right, thank you for proposition reply. And that is it for the grand finals debate. Yay for everyone. Congratulations. You guys may virtually fist bump, shake hands, share emojis, share smiles, because this is not, we can't share